The rise of China is reshaping the world. What was a starving nation, ravaged by civil war and revolution, has become a global superpower.
The hunger for a better life was so huge that they were willing to take enormous risks and make enormous sacrifices.
The whole atmosphere at that time was this kind of hope.
They try to erase the history, erase human memories, so Chinese people cannot know their own past.
China is a haunted house. There were all these weeping ghosts in the air from all these past tragedies and disasters.
There's a perfect marriage of communism and capitalism when they matched together and created something wow.
China is not good at soft power. Plenty of hard power. But in terms of soft power, not so good.
This is exactly why the government cannot have this generation in their pockets, because they don't understand us at all.
The only way that you can say that a return to the motherland is natural is to completely disregard history.
The rise of China didn't happen overnight. Its roots reach deep into the past. And if we want to understand what's happening now, we need to dig down into the foundations of the China century. Hong Kong has played an outsized role in the China story, a colonial conquest ripped from the Chinese motherland, a tiger economy that helped power the China boom, and a gateway between China and the West. But in recent years, one special feature of Hong Kong has stood out: its defiance of China through the act of protest.
Hong Kong is the one place on Chinese soil where protest has always been allowed. And Hong Kongers have not shied away from protesting. In fact, it's become known as the city of protest because there are just so many protests sort of per head of population. Every year on July the 1st, there's a protest because that was the day that Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty. And politicians and activists marked that day with a march.
The July 1st march in 2019 was part of a series of mass demonstrations that year. Up to 2 million Hong Kongers had already voiced their opposition to a new extradition bill that, if enacted, would allow Hong Kong criminal suspects to be sent to mainland China.
No China extradition! No China extradition!
The atmosphere was really different to the earlier marches. In the first march, there'd been this kind of atmosphere of hope and solidarity that, you know, there was so many people out there, the government must listen, surely it must. But by the time that July 1st came around, it was clear that the government would not listen. The police had tear gas on June the 12th. And it was a very different kind of feeling. A large number of people were at the legislature surrounding it. And a smaller group of people then decided to break into the legislature. I went into the building and it was a huge mess inside. There was graffiti all over the walls, these messages. There was a pillar, and spray painted on the pillar in Chinese were the words, "It was you who taught me that peaceful marches are useless."
I'd say it pretty much illustrated how bad Hong Kong under China's oppression is, because we were supposed to have official and formal channels to reflect our opinions to the government, and the government should have listened. In 2014, in the Umbrella Revolution, we made use of peaceful protests. 1 million people, 2 million people were on the streets.
Want to fight for self-determination.
We have had reasonable debates in the past. We try to run for election and someone is elected. But then they got disqualified. Someone tried to run but were denied to run. I grew up witnessing the system completely failing. So the slogan means that it is the government, it is Beijing that told us that playing by their rules will not work. In the chamber, there are people raising a colonial flag. It is not meaning that we love the colonial era so much, but it cannot be worse. We would rather go back to colonial times because this now is worse than that period of time.
Hong Kong's troubleshooters, the riot police, are called with typically British restraint, the police tactical unit.
Disperse or use this. Disperse or use this. Disperse or use this.
For 150 years, the port city of Hong Kong was the pearl of the British Empire. Gouged from Imperial China in 1842 as a spoil of the First Opium War. In the 1960s, the colony was booming thanks to its open market and undemocratic government that favoured the business elite. The majority of the workforce were refugees and migrants from communist China, seeking opportunity in the emerging industrial hub.
My parents came to Hong Kong from mainland China a year before the Chinese Communist Party came to power. My father was a merchant, and I think he was very worried about communist rule. So he decided, like many other people, to flee. Many people work in factories, making wigs or plastic flowers or textile or whatever. The conditions of the workers were quite bad. So actually the colonial government had a lot to answer for. And the business community, they were also very bad. And they did not really want to improve the condition of the workers. And also the unions, many of them are controlled or influenced by the communists.
In June 1967, a strike at an artificial flower factory grew beyond the factory gates into street protests.
It started as labor unrest, but then the local trade unionists became radicalized. They sort of start taking part in sort of class war against the British overlords and the wealthy class.
Radicals in Hong Kong were inspired by the Cultural Revolution, Communist leader Mao Zedong's anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist crusade, then gripping mainland China.
The workers marched to Government House in groups, chanting and singing revolutionary songs. They demanded to see the governor, Sir David Trench, and to present him with a petition. The Government House poodle was evacuated to the SPCA when the clamour gave him a neurosis.
Initially, there was support for them because they were fighting for the rights of the workers. And many people feel, yeah, well, these fat cats and the colonial government were bad. They didn't look after them. But then they started to have violence. There were confrontations between the police and the protesters, who were mainly pro-communists. I remember as a kid, and we walk around, and then some people would say, oh, don't go that way, because the road is blocked. There are bombs over there. A number of people were injured and killed by the bombs. And the people say, hey, what the hell's going on? You're killing us. So I think in the end, their support dwindled, and people became more sympathetic with the government, which was trying to bring peace back.
By turning violent, that was the turning point. Hong Kong people at that time were united in opposing violence. With such support, the British government felt comfortable about taking a firm line against the troublemakers. The policemen used tear gas. They raided several pro-China media outlets. They used offenses like sedition. In fact, they rushed through 5 emergency regulations. The British garrison was called in to help.
General salute. Present. Out.
They dealt with the riots with a firm hand.
The 1967 riots left their mark on Hong Kong long after the streets were cleared. A new colonial administration under Governor Murray McLehose took the protests as a rallying call for change.
Sir Murray McLehose realized you need to build a better bridge between the government and the people. So they set up a city district officer scheme. And in fact, I became one of the city district officers. And I think he did a lot of good for Hong Kong. 10-year housing program, public housing.
The Hong Kong government has already resettled more than 1 million people. In fact, 26% of the population has been rehoused by the government.
McLehose embarked on this housing program and also program to give compulsory education.
Music offices, cultural centers greatly enriched our cultural life, and our economy took off just based on free market.
Hong Kong flourished in the 1970s. Homegrown cinema and pop music launched a different kind of cultural revolution. As China staggered through a decade of political violence, Hong Kongers embraced stability. With better wages and welfare, the rule of law, and freedoms of speech and assembly, if still not the freedom to elect their government. It was a time of prosperity and hope. But it couldn't last forever.
In the 80s, but soon in the 80s, the jitter set in because of the future issue. 1997 was drawing near.
1997 marked the end of Britain's lease of the new territories, which form the bulk of Hong Kong's landmass. Although Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula had been ceded to Britain in perpetuity, it was understood that losing the new territories would spell the end of the colony and its return to Chinese sovereignty.
People came here as migrants, as refugees. But most people accepted the Chinese. And they also accepted Hong Kong is Chinese soil. It's not British soil. Britain took it. So many would not want to come out and ask the colonial rulers to stay. I think they would find it very difficult to ask, hey, don't go, stay. That they cannot, they don't want to do that. But the people were afraid of the communists.
In December 1984, after 2 years of negotiations, China and Britain sealed the deal on the handover of Hong Kong.
I was the Hong Kong correspondent of the Far Eastern Economic Review. And Mrs. Thatcher, as Prime Minister of Britain, had just signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Beijing. And then she flew to Hong Kong to hold a press conference. It was Sino-British secret negotiations. So who the hell represented Hong Kong people? No one. So that all built up to my question.
Prime Minister, on Wednesday, you signed an agreement with China promising to deliver over 5 million people into the hands of a communist dictatorship. Is this morally defensible, or is it really true that in international politics, the highest form of morality is one's own national interest?
Can I just say this to you?
Oh, she was very, very condescending. Let me tell you this. I mean, some of the British journalists who saw this, oh, they say that's classic Thatcher. So patronizing.
I think you would have had great cause to complain had the government of Great Britain done nothing until 1997. And I believe that most of the people in Hong Kong think the same. You may be a solitary exception.
In George Orwell's 1984, the book, solitary exception is the definition for insanity. And that's what Maggie thought of me. Of course, many people agree with me, but they did not say so.
The Joint Declaration established the terms on which Hong Kong would be returned to China. Under the model of one country, two systems, China would hold sovereignty over Hong Kong, but the city would retain its capitalist economy, its independent legal system, and its freedoms of speech and assembly, unchanged for a period of 50 years. The Joint Declaration did not set out a pathway for democracy, an omission that was criticised in Hong Kong, including by members of the local government.
Quite a lot of us living in Hong Kong have been suggesting for years and years that we should have more representation of the people, because if we don't, we could have the alternative, which could be riots. If you don't have any kind of representation, you're bound to have injustice. If you have injustice, you've got discontent. If you've got discontent, you could get riots.
It was a call for more representation that brought over 1 million Chinese protesters onto Beijing's Tiananmen Square in 1989, demanding democracy in the communist dictatorship. Their defiance struck a chord in Hong Kong.
Protesters jammed the streets demanding the resignation of China's leaders. And these people have more than a passing interest in what's happening on the mainland. In 8 years from now, Hong Kong will be part of China once again.
We had so many big marches in Hong Kong, marches of 1 or 2 million. And even the Jockey Club allowed the people to take over the racecourse in Happy Valley to hold big rallies and with pop stars singing to raise money and so on. So it was all very moving.
We were all watching TV, and we were all highly sympathetic toward the students, but some of us knew the way the protests dragged on and the numbers increased in Tiananmen Square, it would not have a good ending. When you have such large numbers gathering, challenging the central government, how do you resolve it?
The Hong Kong people were really completely devastated when they saw what happened in Beijing. They saw so many people demonstrating so peacefully on Tiananmen Square, and then later crushed by tanks and machine guns and all that, and they just could not accept it. And they were very, very angry. I think it really changed Hong Kong.
"1989 inspired an emerging generation of Hong Kong activists to push for democratic change in the final years of British rule. In the drafting of Hong Kong's basic law, China had committed to opening some of the seats on the Legislative Council to direct elections. London and Beijing agreed that the ultimate aim was for all seats and the leader of the government, the chief executive, to be elected by a vote of the people.
In 91, there were elections to the Legislative Council for the first time. So I gave up my job at the Review. I mounted a campaign for 6 months, and I won. I got the highest number of votes in my constituency. So, I told Thatcher, no longer solitary exception.
Democracy advocates found an ally come lately in Hong Kong's last colonial governor, Chris Patten.
We must make possible the widest democratic participation by the people of Hong Kong in the running of their own affairs.
Well, Patten came and he tried to introduce some reforms. The Chinese, of course, did not like him at all, and they call him a sinner for 1,000 years. But what Patten tried to introduce was not full democracy. It was just a bit better. It was, of course, very little and very late. After the handover, we knew that it would be different, and we all have to work very hard to fight for our future.
On July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty. A new generation of Hong Kongers would grow up knowing that they were part of China. And yet, they would also grow up feeling less and less Chinese. The handover had set Hong Kong's youth and their new masters on a collision course.
I was very, very lucky to grow up in the most free time in Hong Kong when it comes to relationship with China. We were allowed to do a lot of things, say a lot of things, experiment a lot of things. We can freely talk about our political ideas. So it always feels very natural to me to be able to say whatever I want, whatever I believe in. But after 2003, I started to realize, okay, that freedom that we thought we had when I see people debate on television is not actually that guaranteed. There are threats to that.
In February 2003, Chief Executive Tung Chee-hwa and Secretary for Security Regina Ip tabled a bill to introduce a new national security law under Article 23 of the Basic Law.
Introducing the national security law was my job, and it was Hong Kong's constitutional duty. Article 23 says Hong Kong shall, on its own, legislate to prohibit 7 national security offenses. Our proposal to apply treason offense to everybody was well justified. Treason, sedition, theft of state secrets, espionage, subversion, violent overthrow of government, and secession.
This was a very unpopular law. There was a sense that it would seriously circumscribe rights and freedoms in Hong Kong. And at the same time, the populace realized they actually had no way to stop this through the formal mechanisms of government. The chief executive was effectively hand-chosen by Beijing and the tycoons. The Legislative Council was dominated by the pro-Beijing parties, and so they decided they would take to the streets and protest.
On July 1st, 2003, the 6th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China, 500,000 people marched against the national security law.
This is the first time I heard about the concept of going onto the street and protest. Family members or classmates, parents are talking about going onto the street and considering taking the kids. It was all a blur to me, of course, because I was too young, but this is the first time I realized what is a political protest.
So many people marching with their kids, with their elderly parents, and there were senior partners of law firms, bankers, all marching. Why? One thing, they thought they were going to lose their freedom. Particularly, they thought the government would criminalize free speech.
I think we underestimated how organized the opposition, how skillful they were able to twist public opinion by branding all these China-related legislation as evil.
The Hong Kong people are not idiots, and they are not that easily manipulated. So it was the people who mobilized themselves, or you can say it was Regina Yip who mobilized us.
We lost the PR and communication war. And it was a turning point for the government because from that time onward, people knew they could resort to mass mobilization to force the government to cave in. And this is what happened ever since.
The success of 2003 galvanized the protest movement in Hong Kong. In the following year, there were almost 2,000 protests, an average of more than 5 per day.
In the basic law, it says ultimately we can have democracy. But you've also heard of the expression, ultimately, or in the long term, we're all dead. The first chief executive of Hong Kong, Mr. C.H. Tung, he said, no, you know, Hong Kong is known as the city of protests. I said, well, that's right, C.H. Why don't you ask yourself why? We have so many protests over the years. So even this tourist guide, the Lonely Planet, put down as, you know, one of the colorful thing about Hong Kong is a protest. It was really an awakening of the people. They say, oh, wow, gee, we can, you know, be so powerful coming out to fight for what we believe in. But still, we did not have full democracy.
As I grew up, I started to realize things were very, very wrong. I realized the problem of Hong Kong is not actually what kind of policy or what kind of things we're advocating, but that the political system fundamentally does not allow any changes to take place in Hong Kong because we don't have a genuine democratic election.
More than 2 decades since the drafting of the Basic Law, its promise of democracy was yet to be fulfilled. The chief executive was still selected by a pro-Beijing committee, and only half of the members of the Legislative Council were elected by the people.
We are not free and we cannot control our own fate. One country, two systems feels like a chain that is tied around Hong Kong people. And so I feel like if I really want to change something, if I really want to see changes in policy, then these things have to change. The fundamental political system has to change before we can talk about any other things.
In 2014, the central government in Beijing issued a white paper that set out essentially their view of one country, two systems. Beijing had promised that they would introduce reforms that would allow the chief executive in Hong Kong to be selected by way of universal suffrage, by a vote of the people. However, it was a very limited form of democracy that Beijing ultimately offered. They said that would not be open to the whole community to select the candidates, and only a limited number of 2 to 3 candidates would be allowed to run in the election.
We were furious because it was promised on the Basic Law that we are going to have universal suffrage. And universal suffrage means universal suffrage. It doesn't mean having handpicked candidates. So no, we're not accepting that.
It started with a Hong Kong U professor, Benny Tai, calling for Occupy Central with love and whatever, you know, love and peace. To put pressure on Beijing to agree to a faster pace of democratic development. But the young people took over.
There were strikes and students went into the government headquarters square. I did too, I was there too. This evolved into protest, and on the 28th of September, in Admiralty, outside the government headquarters, we took over the streets.
As police tried to restrict access to the site, people naturally spilled over onto the roads, blocking a very large highway outside the government headquarters.
More and more people are coming out, and I think there were around 100,000 people near that area. And then suddenly, people said, they're raising a flag. And the next second, I saw a tear gas bomb right in front of me. And everybody just turned around and tried to go to safety. I was very afraid. I was crying, and I couldn't make any sense out of the whole thing. I was shocked. I never imagined in my life I'd see something like that.
On September 29, 2014, Hong Kong woke to the news that police had fired tear gas on peaceful protesters, many of them students.
This was very shocking because it was the first time that tear gas had been used by the Hong Kong police against the Hong Kong people since the 1967 era riots.
It made a lot of people more angry, even those who didn't support the students and the protesters at first. They said, this is outrageous, you cannot do that, and then more people went onto the street.
The whole of Hong Kong has changed because they fired the tear gas and the people just flooded into the Admiralty area. The thoroughfare, everywhere there were people.
We took out highways around the government headquarters, and there started to be tents setting up on the roads. There were people setting up food stations. And people would be texting me, oh, do you know where can I stop my car? I have a car full of bananas, but I don't know where can I unload those things. And then slowly it developed into a community.
Over days and weeks, the occupation grew into a movement known as the Umbrella Revolution. Uniting veteran activists with students around the demand for universal suffrage.
By the time that I went there, it wasn't so much a protest site as a kind of protest village, a whole ecosystem. Tents all along the streets. There was even a rumor that postmen were delivering letters to the tents. I don't know if that was true or not. But there was that kind of level of organization where they had set up recycling stations. There was a homework tent where students could continue to study.
I was not one of those people who were doing assignments because I didn't study much that semester because of the movement. I was too busy with other things, which was a mistake, obviously.
It was a place that was really thrumming with energy, and it was a kind of utopia.
everyone was very hopeful that the government will have to respond because we've never seen such an Occupy movement that was so successful, so self-organized, and so peaceful. But then, as time goes by, there started to be discussions about if it is the right way to do things. Because the government is not responding. What are we doing here? Are we really gonna get universal suffrage simply by staying here, studying, building artworks, or writing memos on the wall? In every democratic movement in the world, there will always be this debate between radical and peaceful means. I was, of course, one of those being radical, saying that, why are we still staying peaceful when we know it doesn't work? I remember that kind of turned into mutual hatred between the two groups.
After some time, it was quite obvious that the administration was not going to give in. So the older generation, they wanted to end, but the youngsters would not. And if they criticize, they say, what you have done in the past, your tactic, your strategy doesn't work anymore, that's fine. You go and have some new strategy. But there are certain things, you know when to go forward and when to take a step back so that you can live to fight another day.
As the months dragged on and with winter coming in Hong Kong, the weather was getting colder and it was getting more and more difficult to sustain this occupation. And in the end, the government saw their opportunity. They encouraged some companies to seek injunctions in the courts to demand that the roads be cleared. And then the police announced that on a set day they would be coming in to clear the road and clear the protest sites. And reopen the roads to traffic. By nightfall, traffic was once again driving along those streets.
By that time, Hong Kong already was in the grip of a rise of localism. Hong Kong nationalism started to emerge. It is a matter of great national significance to China that we do not become a separate, independent entity.
In the wake of the umbrella movement, there was clearly a sense from Beijing that they wanted to reassert control over Hong Kong. All of the key protest leaders were systematically targeted and many of them jailed for their role in the umbrella movement. In 2016, following the Legislative Council election, a number of the successful pro-democracy candidates engaged in acts of symbolic protest when swearing their legislative oaths. Some of them deliberately misread the oaths or engaged in other actions. The National People's Congress in Beijing intervened, issued a new interpretation of the Basic Law, which then enabled the Hong Kong government to kick out a number of these pro-democracy legislators from the legislature.
After that, people were extremely disheartened. They were disillusioned. They felt that this government did not represent them anymore, that it was not listening to the people of Hong Kong anymore, that its ultimate loyalties were to Beijing.
I started to realize I have lost faith in the system. I don't trust the police force. I don't trust the government. Whatever they say, I won't be able to believe them anymore. I think it's really the feeling of being cheated on. Like you feel like they ripped part of your trust out and that can never be restored. People started to get more radical out of that powerlessness and helplessness. And so this kind of frustration piles up and develops into what the world saw in 2019.
The contrast between 2019 and the umbrella movement in 2014 was very stark. It was really a movement from utopia to dystopia. all-black outfits with the gas masks and the hard hats. And then having these battles on the streets in clouds of tear gas. You could look out across the skyline and see smoke rising into the sky all across the skyline where barricades were on fire. And people were very anxious about what this would lead to. Would it lead to a violent crackdown from Beijing? People were talking in terms of the death of Hong Kong, or that this was some kind of final fight, and if they didn't get what they were fighting for this time, then all would be lost.
When the movement broke out, I was in Germany, and it was torturing to see. My friends were all out there, and all I can do is frantically texting everyone, "Are you safe? Are you back?" If I don't hear from you in another 1 hour, I'm gonna call a lawyer for you. Before they went into protest, they had developed a habit of recording a short video message saying, "Oh, I'm who and who, today is what date, and if something happened to me, if I die or disappear, this is completely against my will." So I received dozens of these videos for safekeeping reasons because they don't know who they can give it to in Hong Kong. So this is basically how I can help.
No extradition to China! No extradition to China!
What had begun in March as peaceful opposition to an extradition bill, by August had become street warfare. Radical young activists, known as frontliners, defied a ban on protests to push the 5 demands of the movement, including an investigation into police brutality and full democracy for Hong Kong.
The situation that Hong Kong found itself in 2019 was an escalating cycle of violence. Each side, on both the protesters and the police side, would try to respond to and counter the other's use of violence, and that would lead to an escalation on both sides. But the ultimate problem really was that the government wasn't responding or engaging in any way with the protesters and leaving the police as the only interface between the people and the government.
It was really bad, and the police were terrible. The authorities here and in Beijing have no appetite for any dialogue. In fact, they want to wipe us out. But no matter what, I do not support violence.
I do not think protesters used violence. I would say it is the use of force. Usually against objects, and those objects are not randomly picked by us. When we went into the Legislative Council, That is actually a very symbolic building because it represents the crumbling and corrupted system. When we go to Chinese-funded banks, we do that because it represents Chinese economic influence in Hong Kong. Or when we go to MTR stations because they help the police. And so I support the use of force because peaceful means and means within the system do not work. And what do you do when the system fails?
The violence escalated. At the height, mid-November, 2 university campuses were occupied. The district was like a battlefield. $8,000 petrol bombs found. 2 tons of gasoline found on the campus of Chinese University.
The level of open defiance to Communist Party rule on the streets of Hong Kong in 2019 was greater than anything seen anywhere in China, at least since 1989. Beijing really could just no longer sit by, and they felt they had to step in and intervene in a very decisive way with the introduction of a national security law.
Beijing imposed the national security law on Hong Kong in June 2020. That law gives the Chinese central government the power to override the rights and freedoms and the autonomy that Hong Kong was promised in the Basic Law. Critics say it marks the end of one country, 2 systems and the death of Hong Kong as a city of protest.
Living in Hong Kong has become precarious in ways that we couldn't possibly have imagined. All those things that Hong Kongers valued the most, they've all been chipped away, and it's really devastating to see that. And I think one of the hardest things is looking forward. What will the next 5, 10, 15 years be for Hong Kong? You know, we can't even imagine what the next few months look like. I think nobody imagined that the national security legislation would be imposed in this way and that there would be so many arrests.
Seeing friends and colleagues put behind bars, I am terrified. I'm afraid that I will never see them in person again. The only way I'll be able to get into contact with them is writing letters to them. But that might no longer be possible because maybe writing to them would put them into even more danger that they already are in. And I feel very guilty that I was not there. I can't even attend their trials. I can't even personally be there when they were being sent behind bars. And I just wish I did a lot better than I am doing now. If I do better at lobbying, if I say things better, maybe things would be better for them. Maybe they won't get arrested.
In the past 3 weeks, a total of 23 activists journalists, and councillors came under arrest.
The major political cleavage in Hong Kong is about China. To heal the rift in our society, we need to, resolve this problem, particularly in regard to the young people. We need to help them come to terms with the reality that we are part of China. It will take a long time to deal with, and you cannot enforce patriotism. It is the sense of belonging, sense of identity needs to be cultivated over time.
This kind of mindset is exactly why the government cannot have this generation in their pockets, because they don't understand us at all. We will eventually win. Dictatorship must fall according to history books. They always fail. So I do believe that we will win, but not in such hopeful ways. It will be very, very bloody and very, very intense. I am hopeful in a very pessimistic way, I'd say.
Next time, in the final episode of the China Century. East, West, and the new Cold War.
No one wants a war, but increasingly in the last few years, people have started to talk about that conflict as if it's inevitable. And I think the problem that comes when people start to regard war as inevitable is that people stop trying to prevent it, and instead they start trying to position themselves to start it under the most favorable circumstances.